Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Classroom Matters podcast with me, your host, Kristy Houle, where we dive into the hottest topics in education. Today, our guest is Betsy Hill. Betsy is a neuroeducator and a mother of three and the co-author of Your Child Learns Differently, Now What? The Truth for Parents. Betsy, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to the show.
Oh, Kristy, it's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I introduced you as a neuroeducator, and I also want to take a minute to introduce Samantha to our guests as well who are watching and maybe talking. Sam is new to the episode today. Sam is with us, and she is an intern who is really just interested in possibly diving into the world of podcasting. So Sam, welcome to the episode as well, and I'm really happy that you're here joining us.
Thank you, Kristy. I'm honored to have the opportunity to be here.
Okay, so neuroeducator. We're going to throw around a lot of things today, Betsy, neuroeducator and cognitive skills and cognitive literacy. But let's kind of just start with you explaining a little bit to our audience and to our listeners about your background, what got you here, and really what that means to be a neuroeducator.
Sure. So neuroeducator is actually a term that I coined because it took so many syllables to explain it otherwise. But basically, I started off as a teacher in the classroom, as so many people and many of those who are watching do and are. And I loved aspects of teaching and also found some of it very frustrating. I taught foreign language in high school, and there were some of my students that just absorbed it like it was drinking water, and there were others that struggled and struggled and struggled. And for those who struggled, I didn't necessarily have much in my toolbox. There was teaching and reteaching and trying to help them and trying to break it down the way that we all do. And so I didn't know that. I also raised three boys who were very bright and in different ways, and who when we'd go to parent-teacher conferences, especially by the time they got into middle school and high school, we would hear over and over again, well, he's not working to his potential. And you could fill in the name with any of my three sons, basically. And they got so tired of hearing that they called it the P word. They didn't want to hear potential because the implication is that they weren't working hard enough, right? And what I know now, and what have made both my teaching and my parenting experiences very different, is that underlying all of this are these skills that we call cognitive skills. And when we understand really how the brain learns, what's happening when the brain is learning, which is different from what happens when teaching goes on, because teaching can go on and when there's no learning going on. And learning is always going on in some way, shape, or form. So really understanding what it means when the brain learns and how to construct educational experiences to foster that, and what we can do to support and to improve those underlying skills. So it really sort of just pairs being a trained and passionate educator, of which there are many, with a real understanding and study of the neuroscience of learning and what the neuroscience, we can have real practical application to learning and teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you talk about, I'm glad that you said that, the practical application, because a lot of teachers will listen to this and they'll look at the book and they'll read the book and they'll, learn a little bit about cognitive literacy and cognitive skills and think, yeah, in theory, that sounds great. The application of that can sometimes be more difficult to wrap your head around as a teacher who's walking into a classroom every day with 27 kids, and you're going to have kids that are learning completely differently. So do you think that we just haven't caught up? Because you also talked a lot about teaching and learning, and sometimes there's teaching but no learning, and sometimes there's students learning but not necessarily from the teaching that's happening in the classroom. And so do you think that the system of education and how we're running classroom settings just really hasn't caught up yet to these types of instructional methods in teaching children?
I think we have not generally caught up yet. I think we are still, and then there are exceptions for sure. So I don't want to, paint everybody with the same brush, but most teachers, when I talk to them about this kind of thing, get really interested in it. They really want to delve in. They really want to understand more. Because when you're dealing with 27 students and it's 27 different brains, which are really 27 black boxes, if it can be very difficult. And so you sort of hope for the best and teach to the middle and those kinds of things. But the model that everybody is sort of a widget and that we can put them through this process of, we have a unit and we have lessons and we can put everybody through the same thing and everybody come out knowing the same stuff just really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it can be somewhat challenging, intimidating to think about trying to differentiate. And one of the things, everybody does learn differently. We can construct learning experiences. So I think part of what is needed is to rethink how we think about the role of the teacher. So traditionally, the role of the teacher has been the one who knows stuff, whatever it is, math, science, reading, and who is going to give that to you and somehow get it into your head. And that's not actually consistent with how we learn. Every brain has to build that knowledge and those skills by themselves. And we do that by interacting with the environment, by practicing, by doing all those kinds of things. So the teacher's role, and this is what I try to remember, is that it's about creating that learning experience that allows students' brains to build it. So you can create a wonderful learning experience that can be used by brains that learn very differently if you know how to do that. So here's a really simple example. When we do a cognitive assessment, we can see how strong a student's verbal memory is and how strong their visual memory is. So verbal memory is simply your ability to remember information, to learn information that comes at you from what you hear and what you read. So it's language-based information. Visual information is non-language-based information. So a picture, a chart, a graph, a diagram, a model, any of those kinds of things that we take in visually. And it turns out that most of us have one of those skills that is stronger than the other. So when we talk about so-and-so has poor memory or good memory, we need to be a little bit more specific about that. So now think about a child who has strong verbal memory and a child who has strong visual memory, and think about the assignment of learning vocabulary words. You probably all had this assignment where the teacher asks you to, write the new vocabulary word, write the definition of the word, and then write the word in a sentence. You had that, Kristy?
Oh, yes.
Done that assignment? Yeah. Sam,
Yes.
You too, probably. Yeah. Okay. So if you're somebody who has great verbal memory, it's a wonderful way to learn vocabulary words. But if you really struggle to remember what you read and it would start with language-based information, that's a terrible way to learn vocabulary words. And you probably are instantly going, oh, well, what we should do is we should have them draw a picture. And that's exactly what we should be doing. We can give students opportunities to use their strengths to make it more productive, to create better learning, and that's learning that's more enduring, that will stick with them. Somebody the other day was talking to me, oh, you're just trying to make brains stickier. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to think about it. I mean, I love that analogy of just making the brain stickier. And you're talking a lot about short-term memory, long-term memory. And, as you were saying those things, as, the educator in my mind and the administrator, in me is thinking, yes, that makes perfect sense. And I'm curious as to your opinion on, do you think that, and I'm going to say the A word, assessments, that state assessments have sort of stunted our educational growth in the manner in which we're actually teaching in ways that we know might stick better, so instead of teaching students in the way that they learn best and really wanting things for retention and to make sense to them, we're just sort of shoving them full of facts and information.
Right. It's about covering it. It's about getting through it. It's about, if learning isn't happening, what a waste of everybody's time that is, and I do think, you asked the sort of the lightning bolt question about standardized assessments, I think standardized assessments play a role and can play a role in helping us sort of have a gauge overall of our education system. But when they're used to force everybody to teach to a particular test, and that's what happens, then it's very unproductive, because we're focusing on getting through the material. And then we're saying, okay, so as a teacher, I managed to do my job and I got through, all these different units and all these different topics and whatever. But we haven't given the chance for the learner to be active in that process and to actually do what they need to do. And, part of the frustration for teachers is that because kids learn in all kinds of different ways, it is difficult. And they can't necessarily, and they don't really have the resources. So another big issue is that when we don't give teachers the information, very often people get standardized test data months after the year is done. And what that's supposed to do is, it can to give us sort of a barometer of where that system is, maybe, but it doesn't really help us with instruction for individual students. When we know how they learn, we can help them understand it. So we're empowering the student to use their skills better. And we can also identify, so when kids struggle with learning, usually there's a reason for it. And it has to do, we talked a little bit about, you mentioned the term cognitive skills. So usually there is some weakness in one or more cognitive skills that is the reason for the struggles in learning. It's not curriculum, it's not teaching, it's not a whole bunch of things. Usually there's something underlying it that is the problem, but teachers don't know that. And they also don't need to get the chance to adapt and to take the time that's really needed to support students in that way. So meeting those standards and covering stuff as opposed to really developing brains and developing the skills that are absolutely critical. So we're talking about things like attention and working memory and other kinds of memory skills, other executive functions. And you hear educators talking about executive functions these days, but they don't necessarily know what they are or what to do about them. But they are critical for learning and they're critical for behavior. So we start to realize that we have one brain that we use in every situation we're in. Each of our students has a brain that is the same brain they take to math and to reading and to social studies and to the playground and to conversations with adults. And those cognitive skills impact everything that we do. And so when we can improve them, we actually can improve academic performance along with behavior, along with a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. And you talked about teacher resources. So you've mentioned that a few times, right? Giving teachers the resources for multiple things. And so that sort of leads me to the question about I want to get into your book, but also just, we do that with professional development as well, right? Equipping teachers with the correct resources, whether it is the information from a standardized test or their formative assessments or summative assessments, or, professional development on what instructional strategies work best, or something that a district has adopted that you need professional development on. And I know, and and every single person listening to this podcast knows that we have a really bad habit of doing a lot of drive-by professional developments in education, right? That's kind of how I refer to them. We teach them something really fast, and then we expect them to go and do it wonderfully and see results within the end of the year. And if they're lucky, they might get a follow-up professional development on the same thing. But, we just don't do the greatest job of that in education as far as providing teachers with adequate resources and training to really fully reach the whole child and to do some of these things that you're talking about. So with your book, Your Child Learns Differently, Now What? This is a great resource for teachers to be able to slowly start to implement some of these ideas, strategies, the 5 steps in the book that you talk about. So it's not so overwhelming. So talk a little bit to us about your book and what kind of a resource that's going to be for educators, and maybe dive into, if you're okay with that, those 5 steps that this model provides.
Sure. So I have to laugh when you call it drive-by. My mentor, Dr. Pat Wolfe, who wrote a wonderful book called Brain Matters, calls it the seagull method. So the seagull swoops in, drops its load, and leaves. So it's a very similar issue. And I think that it is still the case, and professional development is critical for teachers, but we have to remember that it's still the case that most teacher preparation programs today do not ever mention the word brain. It's as if learning happens in your left elbow or something like that. So there still is a lot of focus on, okay, here's a whole bunch of learning strategies. Well, there are thousands and thousands of evidence-based learning strategies, but they're not appropriate for everybody. And so you can't, I mean, there's some things, some, multisensory content, pretty much that will help everybody. But there are a lot of things that are really, designed to support someone who has a particular cognitive strength or weakness. And if you don't know that, then you have a hard time. So that's really what we focus on in the book. And the book is designed for parents, although a lot of teachers do find it really, really helpful. And so the step one for parents is to take the wheel and to not necessarily depend on educators to do and to see everything, because, as I said, many teachers don't have these resources to help understand. And parents can do a lot on their own. And when both do it, we're going to have very different conversations about how to support kids, that it will be very much more productive. And when we talk to parents, as we work with them, even through parent-teacher conferences and those kinds of things, we always say, this is team Eli, or this is team Sarah, or this is team Jawan, or we're all on that team and we all play a role, including the student. So it turns out that the research is pretty strong that cognitive skills account for 50% of the variability in academic performance. So if you have two students and one's getting A's and one's getting D's, 50% of that difference is accounted for by the difference in their cognitive skills, more than any other factor. And schools, of course, and the systems focus on curriculum, professional development, and all of these things play a role. Class size, technology, curriculum, all those things play a role. The thing that plays the most role is the student themselves. So what we can do when we understand this is leverage. We can give and empower and help that every student play a much bigger role and be more successful in their learning by focusing on the student, what's inside, not necessarily all the stuff that's outside.
Yeah. And so we're talking a lot about students. And so since Sam is with us, and Sam is a student, I wanted to kind of let her chime in and see if she had any thoughts or what we're talking about, because we're really talking about her.
Yeah, so growing up, I went to Center for Creative Learning, CCL, and that really changed my life, honestly. So what we did there was focus more on the critical thinking skills, and it was one day a week where I felt like they saw me. I'm definitely more of a visual learner. I've taken tests on it. I've done all the things. So going to CCL really helped me with that. And it has honestly made school a lot easier. I'm not a straight A student. I get A's and B's, but I still really believe that everything that you're talking about, focusing on the student, focusing on what we need to succeed, is super important. Because if I hadn't gone to CCL, if my parents hadn't noticed that there was something a little bit special about the way that I learn, I don't think I would be as successful in school or even as in life as I am. And it's really interesting, the different things that you're talking about with when you're talking about the vocabulary, allowing some students to draw pictures and some students to write out the definitions. I've had teachers who do that with notes. So there'll be like a note packet. So you can either fill in the blanks or you can take your own notes to try and like offer that. So I think that it's really cool the way that you're offering that to parents specifically. So I wanted to ask though, why are you targeting it to the book to parents? Like, did you consider offering a similar version to teachers, or did you just straight focus on parents?
Well, we work with schools as well as parents and families. So um, what we've seen, and this is not to say that we don't think, because teachers definitely do need this, and we had to start somewhere, and we've worked with families over the last several years and seen sort of a consistent pattern. And this is something that there's so many parents that are so unhappy. It really came to a fore during COVID when parents had their kids at home and they're sitting and watching them, in many cases, struggle with learning in ways that they really never saw before. And they were either, they said one of two things. One is, I'm so grateful and I admire my child's teacher so much, but I can't imagine how they put up with him. Or they, because it's a real struggle. Or they were really unhappy because they saw that there was something going on that and had been told that, oh, everything's okay, everything's fine. So they weren't really getting a full picture and digging underneath the surface of what was going on in school. And so for the first time, they really started to take ownership. And at the end of the day, Kristy, you're a mom, I am. Nobody cares more about your child than you do. And as parents, we do both our children and, frankly, the education system a disservice if all we do is hand them over and say good luck, right? So we really believed that, and we wanted to share this information so that parents could start to understand how unique each of their children is, how uniquely we learn, and to start to appreciate that you're not going to, everybody isn't going to be the same, but every child has within them some, I call them their learning superpowers, and we need to uncover them and help them discover them, because that's so empowering. And parents, if the school isn't equipped and doesn't have the resources, which most teachers don't, to do this, then we believe it's the parent's role and the parent's responsibility. If you're a parent who really cares about raising as Sam's parents obviously did, gave her some opportunities. And by the way, I have two nieces who went to CCL for a while. It's not funny. But we need to, as parents, say, okay, if there's something going on. And what happens when they do that is that they look for resources that may not have been apparent, or may not have been obvious, may not have been something that surfaced. And they can find things that will help their child be more successful. And sometimes, that needs to happen outside of schools. Sometimes it can happen in school. But we started with parents, Sam, because they can take action more quickly than anybody else in a child's sphere of influence most of the time. And so it was really to empower them to work with their children. And because we see much more productive, much happier relationships, kids get along and they have conversations in different ways. When when we work on these cognitive skills, it's about academics, but it's also about everything in life. It's how a child can participate at the dinner table in a conversation. And I've heard that from a number of parents. My child knows when to contribute. They're listening, they're processing, they're, engaging in a different way. So.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. So you talked a little bit about like it's focused around the academics. If you have, say, a straight A student, do you still think it's important for parents to start looking at the way that they learn? Or is it more for when a student starts getting D's or C's, and that's more when the parent should start taking action?
Grades don't tell us often any more about a student than they do about a school or about, you can't put in one measure. So there are lots and lots of children who get straight A's and who work incredibly hard to do that. These are the kids who spend hours and hours on their homework and they don't complain. They're very, usually sometimes they will, but so there are kids that get lost in the process because they manage to just push through and to get it done. But they're anxious. They could be depressed. They could not be spending the kind of time they could with their families. Family game night gets given up because homework just takes so long. It impacts their relationships with their parents because they don't have those. Mom is always checking to see, did you get your homework done? Did you get it in your backpack? And if that takes all evening outside of school, then you have kids who are not getting seen the way that you were seen and not being helped to, just because they can do it that way doesn't mean that's the best. If we can give them the ability to be successful without that kind of stress, then you have a much healthier child, usually in a much better set of relationships.
And I think it goes the other way too, Sam, right? So as you were asking that question, that was a great question, by the way. And as Betsy was talking about students that get straight A's, I think if you look at it from the other perspective too, students that potentially get D's or C's, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't understand the concepts, the important concepts that are being taught, or the important, they're not, they don't have good cognitive skills because maybe they aren't getting the best grades. That could boil down to sometimes they're not responsible enough to turn the work in on time. And so, their grade is suffering based on organizational skills, less on cognitive skills. And so, yes, I totally agree with you, Betsy, that one grade, I've always been of the mindset that I don't really believe in grading, giving children a grade for a content area. I know that we have to have some measure, but I really look forward to the days when we are, really gauging children on the retention of information and the importance of it and how they're applying it to the world and what they want to do, and less on, did they write this paper? Did they do it in the right style? Did they turn it in on the right day? And those, was it, all those things. And so that was a really good question though, Sam.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was. And I think it's important to remember as well that, we think they're not, responsible. I can tell you that there were many homework assignments that were completed in my household that never made it back into class.
Or that maybe had no purpose either. Did you have those, Betsy? Like a homework assignment, I get some of those for my children and I'm like, why are we doing this again? Like it's busy work, right? Just a sort of a time filler.
Right. When we give kids assignments that all it requires them to do is to copy something, that's not resulting in learning, right? When we ask them to remember something, to create something, to try and figure out how to put two things together, then we're giving them an opportunity to elaborate and to interact with the material. And that's what results in learning. I think we all can probably remember something. For me, it was calculus when I got to college, and I got an A- in calculus, and I have no idea what it was all about. I do have a general idea, but we certainly don't remember any of it today. And that was an example of being a very good student who would just do what needed to get done and could, memorize a bunch of stuff and could learn the process, and then would walk away. I don't think it hurt me, but I'm not sure what it contributed to my life, today in terms of what I do. So I think that's, keeping that perspective is really critical as well.
Yeah. So if you have parents that are listening, if they're thinking about this and they're thinking about all of these steps in your book and really wanting to start taking a small step, because you can't do everything at once and it could seem a little overwhelming, but if they're listening, they're thinking, yes, my child definitely is not learning according to what the school thinks they should be doing. And like you said, not reaching their potential, the P word. What are some really small things that they can start doing while they're waiting on your book to get to their house through Amazon? What in the couple of days that it takes them to get your book after they order it. What are some small things that they can be trying and doing that might not feel as overwhelming to them?
So our website is mybrainware.com. Brain as in brain, ware, WARE.com. On the website, and if there's a search bar at the top, so you can just look, and I would encourage them to look for cognitive skills definitions, which has everyday language definitions of all these cognitive processes we're talking about. Parents find that extremely insightful. We also have a cognitive rating scale, which is a way to start to get a handle on how your child learns, and it's free. And so something that any parent can go on and do for their child and start to get insights. And the third thing I'm going to suggest is to use the word yet. And the word yet is very powerful. And the time that it becomes the most important is when your child says, I can't do this. Which you hear from a lot of kids who struggle. I just can't do this. I'm not smart. The days of believing that intelligence was fixed are over, because we know now that intelligence, all of these skills can be improved. And so when you hear your child say that, you say yet, add the word yet to that. I can't do this yet. Then you're starting to support the whole concept that we can learn talents, that they take practice, that there are many things that we can do that we have no idea that we can do. And when we start to create that, it's called growth mindset, another concept that you all are very familiar with, I'm sure. But I would say that, and then it starts then even if you have the conversation about, well, how am I going to get to be able to do that? Then as a parent, you can start to look at some of these things that we talk about in the book. So that you can spend 2 days saying yet a lot, having interesting conversations with your child. And then the book will come and you can maybe learn some more specifics about it.
Okay. Well, Betsy, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a wonderful conversation. And so folks can check you out on your website. Are there other places that they can find you, or is the website the best place to contact you?
That's probably the best place, but we're on Facebook. We have a private group on Facebook called Parents of Struggling Learners. That's another. We're on YouTube. We're, Google Brainware Learning or Google my name, and you'll come up with a lot of resources.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Sam, thank you so much for joining the conversation today as well. It was a pleasure to have you on as well. So Betsy, hopefully we can circle back around and touch base with you maybe once the school year jumps in and some new things are happening, and have another great conversation. But I really appreciate your time with us today.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Okay. And this is Kristy Houle signing off for another episode of the Classroom Matters podcast.